Thank you so much. Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Liz Pierce. I am the lead meeting director for WCG and I am filling in for Christine and Kira who can't be with us today as much as they would like to. So on behalf of the WCG board, thank you all for joining us for our annual Emerging Professionals Talks. WCG would like to thank the 2024-2025 season sponsors, including University Products, Space Saver Interiors, Dorfman Museum Figures, Caring for Textiles, Click Netherfield, Gaylord Archival, Small Corp, Onteco Laser Solutions, and TrueView. Their donations enable WCG to provide networking events, educational programming, honoraria for speakers, and subsidized admissions for members to attend historic venue tours, including the Stonemason-led National Cathedral Tour later this month on Thursday, April 24th. Space is limited, and the deadline to register is coming up next week on April 9th. So please check the website or your email inbox for RSVP instructions. I have a couple of other general announcements. Our DEAI committee will moderate a virtual book club style program titled DEAI Reading Circle, Disability and Conservation on Thursday, April 17th. Again, check the website or your email inbox for RSVP instructions. The annual business meeting and raffle will be hosted in person next month on Thursday, May 1st at the historic MedChi building in Baltimore. An announcement for this year-end of meeting will be released to members soon. WCG is also looking for new board members for next season to help share the responsibility in running of the organization. Would you or someone you know like to volunteer with us in one of the following roles? Treasurer, meeting director, or member events coordinator? If the answer is yes, or you simply want to learn more, please email nominating@washingtonconservationguild.org. That concludes tonight's announcements. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Katie, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to introduce one at a time. I'm Katie Wagner. I, along with Elena Gregg over there, am director of the Emerging Professionals Committee. So first up, we have Isabella Moritz, who will be completing her MA in Fashion and Textile Studies, History, Theory, and Museum Practice, specializing in conservation from the Fashion Institute of Technology this May. She received her BA in Art History with minors in French and Anthropology from Roanoke College in 2022. She works part-time as a conservator with Caring for Textiles and part-time as an educator at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum, where she also works as a curatorial assistant, or worked as one in their 2024 Sewn in America Making Meaning Memory exhibit. She's an interdisciplinary artist with particular love for fiber arts, and in her graduate thesis will be examining how the reconstruction of historical garments can serve both as a conservation technique and provide tactile understanding of the construction and use, of their construction and use. Thank you, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. I did lose my voice this week, so bear with me if I'm a little squeaky tonight. As mentioned, so this talk is going to actually be about the topic of my thesis, which I submitted this morning. So this feels a little bit like a defense. Thank you. So about a year and a half ago, when I was asked to select a topic for my master's thesis, I had just come off a summer spent at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum, working on Sewn in America. The objects I encountered and the conversations that I had with the curator of Fashion and Textiles, Alden O'Brien, during my 3 months as an intern prompted my interest in altered garments. After asking my professors about garments in the department's graduate study collection, I encountered this garment in the state pictured here. A previous student had extensively and beautifully conserved it, but a major problem still remained that kept the garment inside a box instead of being used as a learning tool. At some point during the garment's history, the waistband to this skirt went missing. Aside from this, a number of other curious aspects became apparent, and overall the garment did not seem to neatly fit into the style of any late 19th century periods. So the question became, just how many lives did this garment live before it ended up in our collection, and how can I safely return it to a state where it can be safely and ethically mounted in 3 dimensions? The approach to this thesis, which will be available later this year, was guided by the concept of robust reconstruction put forth by Jane Malcolm Davies. The first 2 chapters deal with the historical reconstruction, the reconfiguration of the garment's history, and the 3rd chapter deals with the physical reconstruction of the missing elements to mount the object. So this talk will be a brief overview of the entire process. So, on to our first section. These were the foundations for the historical reconstruction process, and while I extensively employed pictorial and documentary primary sources, today I'll be focusing on the artifactual primary source. What could be deduced in the absence of any provenance information about the history and use of the ensemble in question, using only the evidence embedded in the material. So my first 2 phases were description and deduction. I observed inconsistent stitch lengths and thread types. The skirt had a mix of hand and machine stitched seams. Some of the embroidered pansies were stitched over the seams and some were sewn into them. The waist yoke was really awkwardly pieced to preserve flowers that had previously been embroidered. The fringe was worked continuously over an altered seam, and stitch holes were existing in the hem from past trim. This is a little overview of the bodice because multiple views will help you understand what's going on in these next detail shots. So it had applied fringe, which was already worked through fie and then applied kind of as a tape, applied embroidered pansies, bizarre piecing of fie and velvet, and even these buttonholes, which are no longer functional. The collar was backed with plain fie, but fringe was worked through it after the construction. The Petersham waist tape inside the bodice listed Fanny and Beer, which is a previously unstudied French couture house. I traced their history through French and American primary sources, including annual almanacs and published diaries of socialites. And in their peak, they were listed amongst the now more well-known houses such as Worth. Mesdames, Fanny and Beer were open at their first address in 1865 or 1866, which burned down during the end of the Paris Commune in May 1871. By August of that year, they had relocated to the address listed on this label. They went their separate ways in 1876, and Madame Fanny stayed at this address while Madame Beer relocated and opened her own house specializing in children's clothing. This timeline placed the initial construction of the garment between 1871 and 1876, and the Petersham waist tape was simply reused during its later alteration. The label was also useful for locating another roughly contemporary garment to the one I was studying. So this dress is housed at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. I decided to visit this garment in person to examine in what I assumed to be its unaltered state, and due to the coloring of the photo online, which is in the top corner, I was expecting to see a magenta dress. Instead, I found a dress in a much more similar colorway to the garment I was studying. A detailed examination of the Connecticut dress showed a similarity in the stitch lengths to the original seams of the FIT dress, and in places with more fading, the thread faded to the same color as parts as the FIT dress. Additionally, both dresses used silk fie with a similar hand and the same selvage width of 25.5 inches. And when I looked inside the middle drapery of the Connecticut skirt, the unfaded color of the fie was almost the same color as the unfaded area of the FIT skirt, which is really hard to capture on camera due to differences in lighting. Since the Connecticut dress retained all of its original passementerie, I was able to examine how the trims were applied. The stitch pattern of the Connecticut trimmings were very similar to the shapes of the stitch hole clusters that I had found throughout the FIT skirt. And the Connecticut dress and FIT dress's hems were worked with the same whip stitch technique, approximately the same stitch and hem lengths. The Connecticut dress had all of its original silk fringe, which was applied as single units at each hem roughly around the same intervals as the stitch holes on the FIT dress's hem, so it's likely that in its original state, the FIT dress had a fringe like this. However, when the fringe was applied to the bodice, the Connecticut dress employed a separate braid that the fringe was worked through before being applied by hand. And on FIT, the fringe was worked through a scrapify and applied by machine. After focusing most of my energy towards the skirt, near the end of my appointment, a closer look at the bodice revealed that it had also been altered, not drastically changing the style, but making the bodice slightly larger. Seams were let out, and there was some bizarre piecing of the lining, and some machine top stitching was added around the altered seams. Comparison of the two waist tapes revealed the same logo and address, but different materials. The FIT bodice used a twill, while the Connecticut bodice used a ribbed watered silk. However, when the Connecticut bodice was let out, the waist tape was also extended by 1.5 inches, and the extension was made of the same twill tape as the FIT waist tape employed. This suggests that the Connecticut alterations were performed in-house by Fanny and Beer. This also suggests that first the Connecticut dress was made, then it was altered around the same time as the FIT dress was originally made. The FIT dress also had to have been made before the logo and Petersham style changed again in 1876 when they split up. The final fascinating detail that came from this is that when the Connecticut dress was altered, the new waist measurement became 27.5 inches, the same waist measurement as the FIT dress. And while many women could have had the same waist measurement at this time, I find it really intriguing that two dresses by the same French couturier, with the same measurements and even employing the same materials, ended up in the United States merely a state apart. And so I do, hopefully, one day the provenance of the FIT dress will turn up. It has not throughout asking many, many different departments at the school and the museum. I don't think it's out of the realm of the possibility that perhaps these two dresses came over together and maybe belong to the same woman. As part of my examination process, I reviewed the condition and treatment reports prepared by the previous student conservator, and I built on their work with my own microscopic fiber analysis and more typical style conservation report of the treatment I performed. These reports are all included as appendices to the thesis. In combination with the paper, which is itself a type of narrative report, these documents serve as, to quote Sarah Scaturo, the truth-imparting assurance that enabled me to intervene on the object no longer as an objective observer, but as an interpreter and surrogate creator of the object's future life. Furthermore, without all of the tedious primary source research done throughout this stage, I would not have had all the information I needed to guide my material and stylistic choices made throughout the physical reconstruction process. For this, I used Malcolm Davies' SMART reconstruction model. Early on, I defined the S-specific purpose of the reconstruction as returning the ensemble for documentary purposes to a state of, again quoting Scaturo, rematerialized fashionability at the time period for which the most evidence still remained, while ensuring that the reconstruction upheld current ethical standards for fashion conservation. Since the output of this process would be a recreation underskirt and a conservation-safe interlining, I produced patterns of the original skirt to aid in that process. I began by using the mylar tracing technique, and then I transferred the patterns to gridded pattern paper. This also allowed me to adjust the patterns back to their original full selvage width. From the gridded paper, I was able to create a digital version of all the pattern pieces. I found, like many other scholars working in the field of reconstruction, that this process forced me to observe and record the construction of the skirt in greater detail than a standard condition map. I was forced to reckon with every stitch, and because I could be responsible for replicating each and every one of them. My patterns record what each pattern piece is shaped like, but they also document all of the seams present, whether they were original or altered, hand or machine stitched, as well as the kind of ghost seam or needle scarring evidence. This pattern was also useful to calculate yardage because I could arrange each piece digitally. First, I used my pattern to calculate how many yards of material went into the construction of the original skirt as it currently exists by aligning all the selvages of the patterns with the width of the fabric. This told me that the original selvage width was 25.5 inches and that 5 yards and 9 inches of material was necessary if the pieces were arranged as efficiently as possible. So that's on the top. On the bottom, it also allowed me to be efficient and save money on the purchase of silk habitai to create the conservation-safe interlayer, because I was able to predict with accuracy that I needed just under 4 yards of material, because the silk habitai was 44 inches wide. I ordered 4 yards to be safe, arranged all the pattern pieces as I planned, and I ended up with exactly as much extra material as is pictured on the end. Furthermore, having a pattern allowed me to compare what currently exists of this skirt with other historical patterns and garments in order to discern what might be missing or which was incorporated into the construction of the bodice later on. Because I had already made a pattern for the FIT skirt, I wanted to compare it to the closest size layer of the Connecticut skirt, for which I made this approximated pattern on the bottom. Based on the number of panels present and where I know the alterations to have occurred, it's possible that the FIT skirt had at least 2 entire panels removed, or at the very least trimmed down significantly to form the godets. It is also likely that it originally had pockets. Comparing the shape of the back panels, which were the easiest to get the definitive shape of due to the selvage width, show that they were similarly constructed originally, so the FIT skirt may have once been much more gathered towards the back, like the Connecticut one. After my experience with this aspect of the reproduction process, I'm now an advocate of producing patterns of a historical garment to create a more robust conservation record, even if there's no attempt to materially recreate it at that point in time. It becomes especially useful if the object in question has been altered. If a material recreation will be attempted, this technique is exceptionally useful for predicting yardage to avoid buying too little or too much fabric. I also had to draft a pattern for the recreation underskirt, so I based this one off of the circa 1902-1903 ensemble from the English Gallery of Costume, which Janet Arnold patterned on pages 52 and 3 of Patterns in Fashion 2. And I adapted its length to have a train slightly longer than the original FIT skirt. So finally, these are all the various elements I produced. First, on the left, I made muslin mock-ups or toiles to test out the patterns I had taken from the original object and the pattern I drafted for the recreation underskirt. This exercise was useful because it allowed me to correct my patterns. For example, the center back panel needed to be 4 inches longer, and I realized as well, through trial and error, which pieces were assembled in what order. The mock-up of the underskirt pattern was also easily transformed into a custom petticoat, which would have been needed anyway to support the object for mounting through the addition of a finished hem and a ruffle. Next, I constructed the recreation underskirt from a modern silk fly and machine-pieced the seams and hand-finished the hem using the same technique as the original skirt. Then, because the expensive new silk fly couldn't be washed without affecting the hand and appearance, I created a replica of the original skirt out of washed silk habitai, and that serves as a barrier between the original garment and the recreated underskirt. I also used jade glue to finish the edges after a discussion with other conservators, mostly because I didn't want to affect the drape of the object by having seams, but also efficiency and sanity. It also helped keep the grain perfectly aligned throughout that whole process because I did the glue and then cut each piece out. This step was very ethically important, especially if this ensemble were ever to be displayed for a longer period of time than just taking these pictures. And finally, I added the original skirt on top of all these layers, and thankfully the habitai layer was invisible and the silhouette was consistent with the fashionable silhouette circa 1902. Here's a detail of my hand-finished underskirt hem next to the hem of the original object. They both have approximately the same number of stitches per inch, and after a bit of practice, I was able to get my hem even narrower and match the width of the original hem. This process gave me insight into the physical experience of making the original object. For the original skirt, it still needed a waistband, so I made one of washed muslin to be the same dimensions as the waistband inside the bodice. I had calculated with my muslin replica how many inches of material needed to be folded into the box pleats at center back. And fascinatingly, when I went to attach the new waistband, the material had crease memory and neatly folded itself back into the same depth of pleats that I had predicted. This also told me that after the alteration had been completed in 1902 to 1904, it remained in this state long enough for the material to form crease memory. It also suggested that the waistband and original underskirt had gone missing after that time. Maybe they were reused with a shirtwaist, which was a style very popular throughout the rest of the Edwardian period. And finally, all of the recreated elements were labeled so that a future conservator or curator does not mistake them as original to the object. This is an ethical point made by several scholars writing about Reconstruction, as well as some conservation codes of ethics. And here is the result of my project, a fully realized mounting of the original ensemble with all of the recreated elements. And along the way, I was able to reconstruct her history from her original construction around 1875 or 6, and the brand that made her, to her alteration around 1902 to 4, to the original underskirt's possible third life, and now, today, her next life will be serving future scholars and conservators at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Here is a fraction of the sources. And thank you so much.
Next up, we have Elle Friedberg. Elle is currently the Mellon Fellow in Objects Conservation at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. They received their Masters of Science from the Winter/University of Delaware program in Art Conservation in 2023, with specializations in objects and preventative conservation. Elle has previously held graduate internship positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and Adam Jenkins Conservation, LLC. They are passionate about community outreach and education and conservation. Welcome.
I'm going to move myself so I can see what the slides are. Okay. You're cooking? Yes. Okay, great. Hi everyone. Thank you for being here for the Emerging Professionals Lecture Series. Today I will be sharing a recent treatment I carried out on a Japanese lacquered iron helmet at the Walters Art Museum. And also, please feel free to ask me questions as I'm going, or I can also do it at the end. Before I get to the helmet, the true star of the show, I wanted to give some background on how this object ended up on my bench. My larger Mellon Fellowship research project is a technical study of a Chinese lacquered folding screen, which quickly launched me into the world of everything lacquer. If you're interested in learning more about the mysteries we uncovered regarding the screen's dating and manufacture, I will offer a shameless plug here to come to my talk this summer at AIC. And spoiler alert, although the screen has an inscription leading us to believe it was from 1681, it turns out it was made much later. Because the folding screen turned into solely a research project, I wanted to deepen my understanding of lacquer treatment strategies. The helmet I will talk about today was a great candidate, as it had many underlying condition issues and was vulnerable to further deterioration in storage. The Walters Art Museum has a substantial collection of Japanese arms and armor, which on the whole is largely understudied. Much of this collection was acquired by the museum's founder, Henry Walters, in 1906, from the Matsuki Collection sale in New York City. The extensive catalog of 555 objects details the sale of paintings, works on paper, metalwork, among many, many other types of objects. Here you can see a range of several examples of helmets, or kabuto, in our collection. I love these early photographs because they show the helmets on these really extravagant stands, something I am still very curious about to find out more. This is the helmet I will be discussing in detail today. The Matsuki catalog lists it with the descriptor fine workmanship, which I find fun, because none of the other listings have that descriptor, so it must be extra special. The helmet is constructed from multiple iron plates that are joined together with iron rivets. Black and red lacquer is present on the lower circumference of the helmet. Prior to lacquer application, the iron was prepared with a textile layer followed by a ground layer. This helmet has two main components, the hachi or helmet bowl and the mabizashi or visor. To give more context for this helmet in comparison to others that you saw on the prior slide, there are some elements you might have noticed that are no longer present. This includes the shikoro or neck guard that would have been attached through these circular openings you see here. one more. Yeah, thank you. And the fukigaeshi, or winglets, that have broken off, which you'll see in the next, right there. And then next slide. In these detail images, you can see the extensive cracking, lifting of the lacquer, along with large significant losses. And you might be able to tell in the picture on the right, the red lacquer on the visor looks particularly rigid and thick. The goal of the treatment was to stabilize the cracked and lifting lacquer while minimizing alteration to the already light damaged surface, all while managing the application of the adhesive and clamping the area without disturbing the surrounding lacquer. Sounds pretty simple. This required some creative problem solving and a DIY attitude. I adopted a Japanese method of clamping using flexible sticks called Shimbari. I read about in a 2015 article published in JAIC, and I considered how I could create something similar for this project. With generous help of our mount maker, Adam Francino, we came up with the idea for this elevated plywood platform with movable L-shaped supports and an ethafoam helmet mount you can see here. This would allow for maximum flexibility as the supports could be clamped in any position. Here you can see the platform in use with the flexible sticks, which I will go into in the next slide. So referencing the paper, I ordered fiberglass rods from a kite making company called Into the Wind. The article suggested adding vinyl caps, seen here in red, which helped protect the cut ends of the fiberglass sticks from splitting and also add a little bit of grip and friction. The authors of the publication, you could do the next slide. The authors of the JAIC publication used silicone and PVC sheeting as a softening system to better distribute pressure from the fiberglass sticks, but I did not have access to these materials, but I was able to find that using a two-part dental silicone mold material, I could create something very similar. I would cast the material to about 1/4 inch thickness, and then I can cut them out into various shapes and bevel the edges, so it was very versatile. The most difficult part was choosing and applying an adhesive, ensuring it only goes behind the lifted areas and not on the sensitive, already light damaged lacquer surface. After several tests, in the end I ended up using a dilute solution of Perlade B48N because of its compatibility with metal surfaces. I chose a 50-50 acetone ethanol solvent mixture to solubilize the adhesive because it allowed for the best working time for my needs. And if you click again, I've listed several other adhesives that were found in the literature that I was reading, but I opted out of these due to either lack of strength, difficulties with the viscosity or application, and inefficient drying time. While I tested brush applications and syringes, I found that Mylar, it was in the slide before. Yeah, Mylar shapes to be the best application tool, and I would apply a drop of adhesive on the Mylar and then carefully slide it behind the lacquer. And that worked successfully. I loved this project even though it presented more challenges than I had anticipated originally. While I did not carry out any treatment on the Chinese lacquer screens I talked about in the very beginning, I did a lot of research on treatment strategies. But as you might think, the screens are flat and have a wooden support. It's probably not too surprising that the helmet, which is an iron support and very three-dimensional surface, would bring about very different challenges. Determining the tension and positioning of the flexible sticks was definitely a learning process. I found that clamping the helmet helps it from shifting. So you can see on the far side another one of those movable L-shaped pieces, keeping the helmet from rotating. Because I had flung a couple of fiberglass sticks across the lab, which I tried to prevent. I used a heated spatula to help soften the particularly rigid red lacquer on the visor before any consolidation. And when I got more comfortable with the process, I learned to maximize my efforts by working on more than one area at a time. So after making my way around the circumference of the helmet, here are some detailed images of the results. You can see here the before and after images, a successful consolidation of a particularly vulnerable area. And you can see with the lifted lacquer properly consolidated, it is less likely to get snagged and further damaged during any sort of handling. And this is an overall view of the proper right side before and after, and the interior of the Mabayashiri. So I just wanted to thank my colleagues at the Walters Art Museum, especially to Adam Verancino, who was generous with his time to help me problem solve with this project, and to the Mellon Foundation for funding my 3 years at the Walters Art Museum. And I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Yes.
Where did you learn the Mylar trick? Because that's awesome. Yeah.
I just, by trying things, I guess. The brush was very difficult. It would like apply too much. And a syringe kind of was unpredictable of how much was going to like splurt out at once. I'm trying to remember if I've used this in another situation, but yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
What was your working time for like when you put the drop onto the Mylar, like before it started to get like gummy or weird?
Yeah, I would have like a whole pile of little Mylar pieces that I sanded each edge. So I would kind of like go through the pile and then eventually clean them all up. So I never really used the same one twice, but I mean, as quickly as I could, I would have the rest of my area like ready. So I would have my sticks ready, and I would have like, sometimes I would even like set up those clamps in place so that I was just like ready to go. So I kind of did like, as if you're doing a ceramic assembly, kind of dry fit everything and have it all ready to go before you start with the adhesive.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for such a great talk. I'm just curious, I'm not familiar with the publication that you cited, but have you found anything that really related to something spherical? Or was this really like a process of trial and error to try to get the tension correct on a surface like that? And most of the time you are dealing with slightly flatter
Yeah.
kind of top thing. Was there anything like, did you encounter?
Yeah, this technique is more common in furniture conservation, especially with lacquered surfaces. So the picture that I did show was on a like three-dimensional like chest, I think it was. Yeah. So it can be used in 3D or flat surfaces. It's kind of about building your frame of how you're going to get those sticks to be in the right position that you want and the right angles.
Sure. And they have facets, they've got flat facets.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of times these frames are used for multiple projects, but some of the times you have to like specially make it for the object that you have, the dimensions and the shape. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last up, we have Sarah Fong. Sarah is a fourth-year undergraduate at the University of Virginia pursuing a BS in chemistry with biochemistry specialization. She has previously performed research in the cultural heritage field as a preservation science intern with the Preservation Research and Testing Division at the Library of Congress, and as an intern with the Scientific Research Department at the National Gallery of Art. She is currently searching for PhD programs that allow her to conduct scientific research in collaboration with conservators at museums. Welcome.
Hi everyone, can you hear me all right? Okay, thank you for the introduction. So in this presentation, I'd like to discuss some of the techniques that can be used in the conservation science field, and I'll discuss some of the ones I used in my research at the National Gallery of Art. So a little bit of background on my research. This project was completed last summer while I was an intern at the National Gallery of Art. I worked with Dr. Joan Walker on the project Characterization of Inkjet Prints, And the goal of this research was to begin a project that characterized works of art created through inkjet printing. And I used 8 techniques on a set of inkjet print study materials. So what is an inkjet print? Well, that can be a complicated question to answer, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to define an inkjet print as a photographic image from a file that is printed using inkjet print technology. So the study prints from this project were from the digital sample set created by the American Institute for Conservation, and the samples all had the same set of images as seen here that were printed on known papers with known ink sets. So I studied 10 of their samples and focused on the areas in the red boxes on the screen here. And the 3 categories of information I wanted to learn about across the different samples included light sensitivity, so if certain ink types were more sensitive to light exposure or were more light fugitive. Physical characteristics, is there a discernible printing pattern? Can you see dots of ink present on the inkjet prints? And materials characterization, so are there any identifying elements associated with specific papers or inks used? So of the 8 techniques I used, I've classified them into 2 categories. So non-destructive techniques refer to those used with artwork because they don't cause damage to the sample and they don't require direct contact to get information. But with my project, since I was using study materials, I was able to use both non-destructive and destructive techniques. So with destructive techniques, for the purpose of this presentation, they refer to techniques that require part of the sample to be harvested or require sampling, or they require direct contact with the sample. So light sensitivity techniques refer to techniques that involved simulations of light exposure. So with the microfade tester, that was a technique that was developed for the conservation science field specifically, and it uses a small intense beam of light to induce color change in a short period of time to simulate long-term light exposure. And this helps to determine if the object of interest is likely to change through measuring the color values over the given test period. So with the weatherometer with colorimetry, that's destructive with respect to the weatherometer because that's an artificial aging technique. You're allowed to set a given light intensity and temperature, and that simulates an aging experiment. And I used colorimetry before and after the weatherometer to measure any changes in color. And these measurements are measurements of the likelihood in a change of color, which is a factor that's important to consider when planning a work of art's display time. So an interesting find from microfade testing revealed that some of the study prints that used inks made with dyes were more sensitive to light than those made with pigments. And the graph here shows the change in color on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. And you'll see there are 2 lines labeled blue wool 1 and blue wool 2. And those are typically used as comparison standards in microfade testing, where anything that changes at a rate faster than blue wool 1 is considered extremely light sensitive. So the 2 samples that I have here were printed on the same type of paper, and they both represented the same type of ink. But whereas the dye-based ink was fading at a rate faster than the blue wool 1, the pigment-based ink was fading at a rate similar to blue wool 2. So the next category of techniques are physical characteristics, and these techniques are helpful when determining the arrangement of materials on a microscopic scale. So with microscopy, you're able to capture images under magnification, which helped me learn more about possible printing patterns. And with SEM, that's considered destructive because it technically requires sampling. You have to harvest part of the sample to stick under the microscope, and it uses an electron beam to capture an image. And if you look at a cross-section of a sample, I was able to learn more about the layer structures and also the depth of ink injection. So an interesting find from using microscopy showed the differences in chromogenic and inkjet prints. So a little bit of background on what a chromogenic print is. It's a print that was developed using a traditional analog photographic technique, and the image results from a photochemical reaction onto the paper, and chemical processing ends up with dye clouds that are suspended in a gelatin matrix. So on a real-life scale, the sample area looked the same between these two images. It was the same location on the image, it was the same color and saturation level, but under magnification, where a chromogenic print has black particles, an inkjet print has a visible printing pattern. And additionally, the composition of black ink in these inkjets was also determined to not be black, but actually be composed of different cyan, magenta, and yellow ink dots. So the first two techniques, part of the materials characterization, used X-rays to identify elemental composition. So with XRF, that detects specific X-ray signals that are associated with specific elements, and EDX is actually a technique that's done with SEM, so it also requires sampling, and that measures X-ray interactions to generate maps of elements present. With the EDX technique, it helped to identify the type of paper used in the study material inkjet prints. So RC or resin-coated papers are a common paper that are used when producing inkjet prints, and they have a distinct layer structure. You can see at the top here, there's a layer of cellulose that's sandwiched between two layers of polyethylene, and then on the top surface layer, there's an ink receiving layer. So in the EDX maps, two of those layers were able to be identified, and just a side note, the images here are technically upside down, so the surface of the sample is going to be on the bottom of the image. So the ink receiving layer, which is on the surface, often contains silica or silicon dioxide, and that's noticeably on the surface of the sample in the EDX map. So the map that contains silicon is on the top layer, which you can see in the blue band there. And the polyethylene layers were also able to be identified. They typically contain titanium dioxide, and the map showing titanium indicates there's a layer right above, or I guess below the ink receiving layer. If you can see the yellow dots that are right above the blue dots, which follows the traditional layer structure of RC papers. So these next two techniques are also part of materials characterization, and they're two modes of FTIR spectroscopy. They both use an infrared beam to detect specific functional groups through measuring molecular vibrations. So ER is a non-contact method, while ATR requires direct contact and is able to detect information on the surface. So my findings showed that coupling multiple FTIR modes together can be helpful in getting surface-specific information. So I was analyzing a sample that was printed on a resin-coated paper, and with the ER mode, silica and polyethylene were able to be detected. The blue arrows indicate peaks associated with polyethylene, and then the big peak in the red box correlates to silica. So the ATR mode, as I've mentioned earlier, is a surface-specific technique, so only elements at the top surface will be detected. And so the ATR spectrum of the same sample shows a peak correlated to a silicon-oxygen bond, indicating silica is present on the surface. So analyzing ER and ATR spectra together can also give insight into layer structures. So in summary, I used 8 techniques that measured 3 different types of categories of data, and using these techniques with each other can get you a better understanding of your sample. And I'd also like to conclude with a few images from my time at the gallery. And then I'd also like to acknowledge just a few of the wonderful people that helped make my experience at the gallery so amazing. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you. Oh, I'll take questions. If anyone has any.
Did you learn anything about the coloring specifically in those study collection pieces?
Could you specify?
Like the different colors that were on the sample piece that you had.
Like elemental?
Yeah, or like the
Talk about your ramen.
Yeah, we did do a few tests with Raman spectroscopy, and that helped to identify that some of the pigments that were used in the inkjet prints were Raman active. I think it was a name that phthalocyanine blue. Yeah.
Were there anything in your findings that came in with any preconceived notions of like, oh, we're definitely going to find this or definitely going to see this, that you were surprised to find once you actually took an analytical look at things?
I think I was most surprised by the microscopy, because I wasn't expecting the black inkjet prints to like not be black ink, and I thought like it would just be maybe one sample, but I think all the samples that I studied were all not black ink, and they were all just that composition.
Sorry, can I just interject? This is a little bit of an aside, but like, yes, microscopy can tell you so much. And like, because it's invasive and it's not so easy to like always do it, it's kind of being phased out a bit. Like, I mean, even in conservation training, we don't get as much of an exposure to it as we probably should, because I'm a huge component of it. I need it for what I do. So yes, I'm really happy that you made that connection.
I think that's it.